Tagway greetings. My name is Roberto Mucaro Borrero. I'm interim director, executive director for the Tribal Link Foundation. I have the great honor and pleasure to welcome you all today to this webinar, this training session on engaging COP27. This is a training session for Indigenous peoples. Today's program is hosted and organized by the Forest Declaration Program, UNDP, Tribal Link Foundation, the International Indigenous Peoples Forum on Climate Change, and the International Indian Treaty Council. I just want to say, Taigwe dituno kena atia ono diri mukaro agoibana boriken taino daka, koaidaka, koaidaka, koaidaka. Just a greeting in my indigenous language. Just reiterating that I'm very happy to be here with all of you today. We're going to have a great program. We have some wonderful speakers. Just to let everyone know, we have simultaneous translation, simultaneous interpretation available in Spanish, French, and Portuguese. So what you'll need to do to access the interpretation, you'll just look down at the bottom of your screen. There should be an interpretation icon. It looks like a little globe on the bottom of your screen. You'll click on the language that you wish to engage the webinar on, whether it's English, Spanish, French, or Portuguese. Click on that icon, and you should be able to hear the interpreters. So if you have any questions, please put them into the chat. We'll try to address them as soon as possible. But right now, I'm going to turn this over to my dear friend and colleague, an Indigenous sister who I've had the pleasure to work with for many years, Rochelle Diver from the International Indian Treaty Council. Thank you. Hahom.
Miigwech, my brother Roberto, thank you for the kind introduction. I'm so pleased to be here with you today. Bonjour, Anin. Good afternoon, good morning, good evening to everyone. As Roberto shared, my name is Rochelle Diver. I am Anishinaabe, a citizen of Fond du Lac Band of Lake Superior, Ojibwe in Minnesota. I am the UN Environmental Treaties Coordinator at the International Indian Treaty Council and a proud board member of the Tribal Link Foundation. I'm calling in today from Treaty 1 territory in Canada, known as Winnipeg, the traditional homelands of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Ojibwe, Dene, Dakota, and Métis. I'm a guest here and would like to pay my respects. I'm really honored to be facilitating this important training today. It's so nice to see robust participation. I see the numbers keep increasing. People from all around the globe, you're very welcome. This training is being offered for Indigenous peoples participating in COP27. It is structured so that both new and returning delegates will benefit from our time here today. This will also be recorded, so you will be able to go back to see the information shared and also share it with your friends and colleagues who are interested or may also be attending COP27. We have an excellent lineup of knowledgeable and experienced speakers to assist with navigating the climate change COP, which will include past work, what to expect in the coming weeks, both good and bad, and touch on future work as well, because these COPs do happen once a year, but the intersessional work is just as important. So with that, I think that we should jump right in, and I'm going to go ahead and introduce our first speaker. The first presentation is going to be by Andrea Carmen of the International Indian Treaty Council. She's the executive director, and she's the former member of the Facilitative Working Group on Local Communities and Indigenous Peoples Platform on behalf of North America. Andrea, welcome, and you have the floor.
Rochelle, respectful greetings to all from the Yaqui Nation here in southern Arizona, and our nation is divided by the border between the United States and Mexico. And we have also a traditional land base and the only treaty with Indigenous peoples and the government of Mexico in Mexico to demarcate our traditional land base called Rio Yaqui. So we are desert Indigenous peoples and bring that perspective into our work at the UNFCCC. I wanted to just start with this slide because it really speaks to the way that we approach our work. We as Indigenous peoples, we as International Indian Treaty Council, myself as a Yaqui Indigenous woman with a family farm that is challenged by climate change here in Tucson, Arizona. But this speaks to the knowledge, not just what's called traditional knowledge, but the scientific knowledge of Indigenous peoples, and it's linked to our culture. These are two corn ceremonial altars from two of our corn peoples conferences that IITC has hosted with local Indigenous peoples that use corn as the basis, not just of our nutrition, but also our identity for our relationship and even our creation stories. And you can see that one is from the Navajo Nation on the left, and one is from Zapoteca peoples in Mexico, and they both use those 4 sacred colors, which to many, many Indigenous peoples also represents the colors of the 4 directions: the white, the yellow, the black, and the red. They're the circle of life and the 4 winds. And also to some, they say it represents the 4 colors of the human family as well. But for us, this is survival. This is our scientific knowledge. Our peoples to this day, our traditional knowledge holders, know by various ways, the moon, the insects, the way the plants talk, whether it's going to be a dry year or a wet year, a cold year or a hot year next year. So they know what color of corn to plant. This is a symbol of our knowledge, our spiritual connection with the natural world and the things that sustain us, but it's also a picture of our rights, because without our right to maintain the original biodiversity of our seeds, free of genetic modification, without our rights to land and water and our cultural heritage, we cannot hope to adapt and survive the climate crisis that's coming. And we also will not be able to contribute to the global discussions like are happening at the UNFCCC. Next slide, please. The UN Framework Convention on Climate Change was conceived back at the first Earth Summit in 1992 in Rio, the World Conference on Sustainable Development, along with other conventions that are in process and in place and active to this day, the Stockholm Convention, the Convention on Biodiversity, because finally the states of the world recognize that we are in a pending and looming crisis as human beings and as the earth because of the human mistreatment of the natural world. So for us as Indigenous peoples, this knowledge goes way back. It's in our prophecies as well, what would happen in this day. And at the Earth Summit, Indigenous peoples were one of the 9 major groups. We were standalone. We weren't combined with anything else like local communities or anything. Indigenous peoples were recognized as one of the 9 major groups that had a key role to play in these discussions on environment protection and sustainable development. And when the International Indian Treaty Council was founded in 1974 and was the first Indigenous organization to be recognized with what's called consultative status with the Economic and Social Council. Now we're upgraded to general consultative status. I think still the only Indigenous organization. We maintained and have maintained to this day that Indigenous peoples need to speak for ourselves on the issues that affect us in the world arena. And probably there's no more important place for that to happen than in the global discussions on climate change. Next slide. I'm going to say something I think all of you know, which is the threat to our survival that is being posed by climate change. This is not an academic discussion. For us, this is life and death. And I think many humans, including politicians and those that we work with in the international arena, may not have grasped this fully, but Indigenous peoples do. And it's important that the UN now estimates that 1 million species face extinction, like the Central California salmon run that's not expected because of the warming temperatures and the effect on this very, very important you could say canary in the mine species. They're not expected to even survive past the end of the century. And many of these species that are threatened are core to not just the food systems of Indigenous peoples, but the ceremonies and the cultural identity of Indigenous peoples. Next slide, please. This is another example. This is from our land here in Tucson, and 2020 was the hottest, driest year ever recorded in the Sonora Desert in Tucson, Arizona. And this is just one of the plants that we depend on for our foods. This is nopal cactus. It's also medicinal. It cures diabetes, so we use it for medicine as well. And you can see it is withering. This is a natural indigenous plant here. In the desert, the nopal, and it's withering and wilting from the extreme heat and dryness that we've experienced. So I just wanted to share that. Of course, everyone knows the warmest 7 years globally have been all since 2015. This is very real and affects us directly. Next slide. I just wanted to show this. This is also from our yard here. This is the Sonora Desert toad, and it's important when we go into these discussions that Indigenous people's holistic view of our ecosystems is carried forward. These toads, a lot of people don't like them, even here. They're venomous. They're the only venomous amphibian in North America, but they come out when the monsoon rains come regularly at the end of July and August, just when we're harvesting the crops, and they eat the bugs. But about 3 years ago, the rains came too soon. They came out of season. They came in June. They all came out of the ground where they hibernate. And then it got really hot and dry again, and they died. And they haven't really come back, you know, like they used to, which means the insects that, you know, prey on the crops when we're ready to harvest them, you know, are rampant without this balance in the ecosystem. And this has already happened. And the world's amphibians are also at the front of the potential extinction chain. Next slide. I'm showing you these slides to help you understand what we take into these discussions at the UNFCCC. Another very important aspect, which is the foundation of our work at the United Nations, is the defense and assertion and affirmation of the rights of Indigenous peoples. And this, of course, is the day the UN Declaration was adopted at the General Assembly, September 13th, 2007. Next slide. I don't need to read all of the articles of the declaration that are key for us in this work, because I know you have your pocket or bedside copy of the UN Declaration that you probably read every night. So I'll just mention that the UN Declaration does affirm that this is the minimum standard for the survival, dignity, and well-being of Indigenous peoples. It also affirms that all UN agencies and bodies are obligated to implement it and follow up on it, along with states, of course. And that includes the UNFCCC, even though it's been a challenge, and I'll talk about that in a minute. Next slide. I'm going to clip through these fairly carefully, or fairly quickly. And I just wanted to affirm some of the rights in the UN Declaration that are the basis of our work in the UNFCCC. One is our right to be secure in the enjoyment of our own means of subsistence. Again, this is a Indigenous woman exuding well-being. That's a salmon right there, the same species that's under threat of extinction. Next slide. And these I'm going to go through pretty fast. This is probably the hardest fought article in the UN Declaration. Negotiations, Article 26, that recognizes our rights to our traditional lands, resources, and water and territories. Next slide. This is very key for us, both as I'll get to the formation of what's called the Local Communities Indigenous Peoples Platform. I think in North America, we just decided to call it the Indigenous Peoples Platform. But the right to free, prior, informed consent relating to development. And this is, of course, the Standing Water Defenders. It's very key for our fight to prevent climate change. And I will say, I'm not charged to talk too much about what's coming up here in COP27, but the big focus, it seems like, for the states now is loss and damage and adaptation, and those are very important for Indigenous peoples, but they're talking less about prevention of greenhouse gas emissions that are the ones that are actually raising the temperature. So we have to, as Indigenous peoples, make sure that we keep the defense of our right to have free, prior, informed consent and to oppose the very causes of climate change, while at the same time we're talking about, you know, how to adapt and how to compensate for loss and damage, including what they call non-economic losses like cultural rights and sacred sites, etc. Next slide. It's really interesting now the UN Human Rights Council and the General Assembly have recognized just in the last year that the right to a clean, safe, and healthy environment is a universal human right. But we kept reminding them that we fought for that language in the UN Declaration, you know, back when it was adopted, and it says that we have the right to the environment, the protection of the environment, and the productive capacity of our lands and resources. That's Article 29, paragraph 1, and that, of course, is a basic right that's threatened by climate change. Next slide. This Article 31 is key to the development as we launched into talking about how the Indigenous Peoples Platform and the Facilitative Working Group would be formed, and whether we even wanted to do this once it was in the Paris Agreement. But the right of Indigenous peoples to maintain, control, and protect our cultural heritage, knowledge, our sciences, important. We have sciences as well, not just something called traditional knowledge. A lot of times we've had to challenge the scientific body, the IITC, dealing with these issues to say, you know, Indigenous peoples have very developed science on these issues. Like I talked about our weather prediction abilities that exist to this day. This is actually my husband here on our land teaching one of our younger tribal members how to protect pomegranate tree from the power of the full eclipse of the moon. And this is part of our knowledge. Next slide. And very key, this has been the real challenge, I think, more than anything at the UNFCCC, is our right to participate in decision-making that would affect our rights. These are our Yaqui traditional authorities making a declaration against aerial spraying of pesticides in our land in Mexico. Next slide. So now I'm going to talk specifically about the UNFCCC, given all of this background I've shared, especially starting with the denial of our right to participate in decision-making. That's still a challenge to this day. We made a lot of progress, and I'll talk about that, but these are just 2 marches. Even though we were recognized back in '92 as one of the 9 major groups whose participation and input were deemed essential for these discussions, we were not even allowed to be in the room where the negotiations were taking place on climate change. And this is just two marches we had outside, you know, back in 2009, 2010 in Cancun and Copenhagen, demanding that Indigenous people's rights be respected and that we be allowed to participate in these discussions. Next slide. All the way up to COP21, the famous Paris Agreement in 2015, we still were not allowed in the room while the negotiations were happening. And again, here we are demonstrating again outside the hall, where this is my counterpart. I was the North America co-member of the coordinating committee for the Indigenous caucus for many years. And this is Chief Bill Erasmus, who will be at COP27. We're having an Arctic food systems side event, but they're chanting, "We are peoples." Next slide. Even though we weren't allowed in the hall, in the room, to even listen to the negotiations, we worked very hard. There was about 200 of us there at COP21, and we lobbied the states. We had press releases, like I showed, we demonstrated outside. We put all kinds of pressure and our top level negotiation skills, and we're able to actually achieve the inclusion of Indigenous rights in the Paris Agreement preamble. First time in a legally binding environmental convention that any human rights, let alone Indigenous rights, were included. Next slide, please. We also received the decision. We were not part of this. We did not call for the creation of a platform, but the states decided that in order to comply with what we did call for, which is respect for Indigenous knowledge and practices in this regard, they decided to create a platform for exchange of experiences and sharing of best practices relating to mitigation and adaptation, as it says, in a holistic and integrated manner. So that's operative paragraph 135. We were a little surprised to see that, but next slide, we decided that after about 3 years of consultations with the states about how this would take place, we decided that, you know, we needed to do it. We would go with that, and under the condition that we would safeguard traditional knowledge and uphold the right to free, prior, informed consent. We don't, like on the portal, which is, you know, the web page for the platform, we don't post knowledge. We talk about programs and projects and declarations by Indigenous peoples at their gatherings, but this is when the platform was, as they call, operationalized, you know, made operational with the establishment of what's called the Facilitative Working Group to coordinate its activities. And that took place at COP24 in 2018 in Katowice. And this is a very historic picture. These are the countries and the Indigenous peoples together celebrating this advance. Next slide. And this is very key. This is the first group. And as Rochelle mentioned, I was honored to be selected to serve in that capacity by North America. And I just wanted to say, this is the only body at the United Nations, and especially, you know, it's kind of amazing, like a miracle, given what we went through before, to even have any kind of voice of participation. It's the only body at the United Nations where we sit equally with states. There are 7 members selected by Indigenous peoples. We don't, for this body, we don't have to go through state approval, like say the Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues or the MREP. Our regions select their representation and the states select their representation, and there's 7 and 7 members, and we work together by consensus. But I will say the states, at least when I was there, tended to defer to the views of Indigenous peoples pretty consistently. And there are also state Indigenous members like my co-chair from a couple years ago, Yel Mulalap on the right. He's from Micronesia, representing the country, but he is an Indigenous person from the Pacific. So we have a little bit more, than half in that time. Next slide. We have have adopted 2 3-year work plans. First for the first group of members, and then we also the first group had to adopt the work plan that they're working on now. So go back a second. I just want to say that one of the most important things, you can leave it on this slide, one of the most important things at COP21 that we really prioritize more than the creation of a platform or anything like that, was keeping the temperature down to 1.5 degrees centigrade over the pre-industrial level, not over 20 years ago, but over before they began to do industry. And this is, one shortfall that we had last year that we have to advance now. 2 of the countries, India and China, wouldn't agree with the language the other countries wanted, the other states wanted, to say that they wanted to phase out coal. It's probably the dirtiest fossil fuel. So they got the language in the final document that says phasing down coal. But the important thing is that fossil fuels emissions were mentioned for the very first time in any outcome document. The Paris Agreement talks about reducing emissions. It talks about keeping the temperature increase down, but it doesn't mention the elephant in the room, which is, of course, fossil fuels. Next slide. The picture, the group picture of the knowledge holders and the Indigenous members, there it is, of the Facilitative Working Group. And this was for the first time, and these are officially invited and funded, 4 from each region that we as the region selected, including for North America, 2 youth and 2 women. We asked all of the regions to select at least 1 youth and 1 woman as knowledge holders, and that will be repeated again this year. That activity, that's activity 1, the most important for the Facilitative Working Group. Go ahead, next. I can clip through. I know I'm running out of time, so I'll go fairly fast, but it's very important that we continue to bring through the knowledge holders, but also just to remind everybody, the Facilitative Working Group does not replace the independent voice of the Indigenous caucus called the International Indigenous Peoples Forum on Climate Change. This supplements with an official voice inside the process as a constituted body, but we have to work in coordination with the caucus to make sure that that independent voice continues. So some of the things we're bringing to the table is the importance of our traditional foods and medicines as the basis for our survival. Next slide. We're bringing, these are activities that Indigenous peoples are doing on the ground, whatever happens at the United Nations. We have to do these things. We're trading original drought-resistant seeds. These are Indigenous peoples from Oklahoma, United States, Guatemala, and Mexico, trading seeds that can adapt to new changing conditions in our lands. Next slide. This is just an example, of the seed trading we're doing now. This is Hopi corn. The Hopis in the northern part of Arizona grow their crops without any irrigation or any rivers or lakes. They're dependent on just rainfall and snow melt. And this is a crop of white corn. White Hopi corn. And the next slide is a picture showing the benefits of the seed trading. This is the first time we've been able to grow ears of corn here on our very dry desert land. You can see the nopal cactus in the background. And this is white Hopi corn seeds that we traded. Next slide. This is survival right here. There's a picture of our survival as Yaqui farmers. Next slide. The buffalo. in the plains section of the United States is very important. There was a freak snow blizzard in 2015. We took this example, in fact, to COP21, where 100,000 cattle died. The ranchers hadn't brought the cattle in. 100,000 died and not one buffalo died. There is a real push. There's 72 tribes in the intertribal buffalo council that are returning the buffalo and removing the cattle, also because buffalo don't pull up the grasslands by the roots. They clip the tops, so they spread the seeds and don't destroy the grasslands, which is very important for preserving the moisture in the soil in drought conditions that we're beginning to face. Next slide. This is just another picture of return of our own scientific traditional knowledge. This is the Tohono Nation right up the road from us, and they're relearning to store rainwater using the natural clay in the soil for irrigation of their crops as well. And the next slide shows another example of water knowledge. The native nation of Hawaii removed the eucalyptus trees, which are an invasive species that use a lot of water. They're from Australia, and they've been able then to have enough water to begin growing their taro again. And you can see this is, their restored taro beds based on the abundance of water once they remove the invasive species. These are the kinds of programs that Indigenous peoples can share with our understanding of the natural world. Next slide. And I am almost done. I know we have other speakers that are going to talk more about what's going to happen. And of course, the importance of intergenerational knowledge sharing. This is something we need to have inside our own peoples, restore those ways that grandparents taught the young ones. And this is Alaska with gathering wild roots, adapting to climate change and different seasonal changes. Next slide. I won't talk too much about the loss and damage, and especially the affirming our right to free, prior, informed consent to oppose pipelines. This is a picture of opposition of the Lakota to the Keystone Pipeline here in the United States. Next slide, please. The issue of loss and damage was addressed by the knowledge holders. And at the COP26, it's going to be a big issue at COP27. As I mentioned, I was a member of a new subcommittee of what's called the Warsaw International Mechanism on Loss and Damage. It's called Non-Economic Losses, the NELS expert group. And it's very important for us to talk there about, the impacts for Indigenous peoples on our culture, on our rights, and those kinds of issues, but also to look at what kind of compensation can be available. We just talked with the United States government delegation yesterday, and they affirmed that all of the economic support for loss and damage is going to the so-called developing world, and Indigenous peoples in the developed world, so-called, that are just as impacted, are left off the picture. So this is some work we need to do coming up at COP27. Next slide. And I know that Graeme, or one of the other speakers, is going to talk about this too, about our achievement last year of getting Indigenous peoples' rights in Article 6 of the Paris Rulebook, and the agreement to have a complaint mechanism for Indigenous peoples that are negatively affected by so-called climate solutions that are displacing them from their lands. So this is something we also need to work on as well, is, how will this complaint mechanism take place, and how Indigenous peoples will be involved in its development and decision making. Next slide. Of our question is, are they finally listening? This is a meeting that we had not just US Indigenous peoples, but you can see, you know, from the Amazon and others with former Secretary of State John Kerry, the climate envoy for the Biden administration here in the US, and Deb Howland, Secretary of Interior, to talk about the importance of their relationship, especially, you know, development, say, of the NDCs, which they have never done, you know, taken on board the leadership and the participation of Indigenous peoples in the US, not just tribal leaders, even though they're very important, but also our knowledge holders and practitioners who are doing this work, as I showed you, on the ground. Next slide, I think it's my final slide. And I just wanted to reaffirm our relationship with our plants, with our animals, with the weather systems, you know, with all aspects of the natural world is going to be the basis of our survival. What we choose to share is up to us, but Indigenous peoples are on board in the policy decisions, not just that affect us and our ability to survive, but our responsibility to protect the natural world and the entire planet, including other members of the human family, is very much in the forefront of our views about how we're coming into this work. So thank you, Joko Tesia. I hope this was helpful.
Miigwech, thank you so much, Andrea. I'm sure that was very helpful for our participants. The background and history of Indigenous peoples' engagement in this process is crucial to understanding how delegates can be impactful and effective at COP27. So thank you so much. And if you'll stay with us for the next 15 minutes or so, we're going to enter in a question and answer session. We already have some questions typed into the chat, but please feel free, especially questions for Andrea at this time. We are also going to put the agenda in the background so you can get a better idea of how this session is laid out. We will have a break in the middle as well, so please keep that in mind. And each panelist will have time for questions and answers after their presentation, as well as an entire Q&A session at the end. So if your question has not been answered right away, please know it might be touched on by another speaker, or we'll tie it all in at the end and make sure all the questions are answered. So thank you so much for listening to those logistics. And Andrea, the first question that came in was from Jean Kayambaya. And she asked a question in French about the 4 colors. So I believe that was in the beginning of your presentation. What do the colors represent and why are they significant? And then I'll give you the second question as well, which is what group or groups make the decision if we are able to be in the room in the negotiations, and what process would be needed to take place to make that a reality? Andrea, if you could take those questions, please, you have the floor.
Thank you. Well, the slide that I showed the 4 colors, which are the colors of the 4 directions. I'm also a sun dancer, and those are the colors that we use there to represent the 4 directions. But these are the 4 colors, the primary colors of corn. And I thought it was interesting to show that in southern Mexico, the Zapoteca use those 4 colors of corn, just like the Dene or Navajo do in North America. And it represents, in this case, the biodiversity of our different colors of corn, which grow best in different climate situations. As I said, that our peoples have the knowledge of whether it will be a wet year or a dry year, a hot year or a cold year in advance. And so we know what colors of corn, what type of corn to plant. But these are the colors also, like, as I said, of the 4 directions, they say the 4 winds, and also to some Indigenous peoples, they represent the 4 main colors of the human family. So I don't know if that explains it well enough, but it also shows that for Indigenous peoples, the connection between our spirituality, our ceremonies, and our very practical day-to-day knowledge for survival based on our original food systems is inseparable. The second question is, who decides? Well, as I said, this is the United Nations, right? It's an organization of the countries. And maybe I didn't explain it. When we say COP, the COP26, COP27, and different conventions also have COPs. We have the COP for the Convention on Biodiversity coming up in December, COP15. COP means Conference of the Parties. The parties to a convention are the states. They're the ones that sign on. So it is the states that decide the modalities of work. So the states had to adopt the work plan of the Facilitative Working Group, the format for its implementation, back at the COP at Katowice. So, that's one reason why we've gotten really good at this, but at the same time, we are not the decision makers in these situations. We have to convince the countries. And this is something we'll be talking about a lot at the caucus.
Thank you, Andrea. And I know Graeme will be touching on that as well. So please stay tuned and you'll get more detailed information that will hopefully fully answer your question in addition to what Andrea just shared. Thank you so much, Andrea. We have a few more questions coming in here. This is quite a general question from Jose Miranda. But it's a question I think is probably on a lot of people's minds. It seems like we're talking a lot, but nothing's really being done. How can we change that? The power of money is everywhere, which is something everybody feels once you enter inside the COP arena. You can almost smell the backdoor deals going on. Big companies do not care about Indigenous peoples. How do we stop this? And then I'll give you one more question, Andrea. Each people has its own reality, positive experiences of adaptation to the climate crisis and threats. What are the common expectations of Indigenous peoples in this COP? Greetings from Peru, from Alberto Neuquén.
Thank you. The first question is, I hope that my presentation could just give a taste of some of the progress that we have made in being able to be heard in this process. And we kind of joke, that it's kind of a, I don't know, a two-edged joke, that they're coming to us now. When we took the knowledge holders for the second part of that activity to meet with the states, the room was full of states, of countries wanting to hear. And you get the feeling, the difference between someone who's just kind of listening to you to check the box. Okay, we talked to Indigenous peoples, now let's go talk to the women, or like that. There's a difference now. And I noticed it for the very first time last year at COP. They really want to know. So we always say, wow, they must really be scared. They're actually coming to us to engage, where they locked us out of the process for so long, and we still are locked out of some of the meetings when it's high level ministerial. We can't get in there, even to listen. It is changing, and it's us who has to change it. And I just want to say, one example that was given that's the same with this process is, somebody said, well, I was wondering about, where are the teeth in the UN process? We have the UN Declaration. We even have these legally binding conventions like the ICERD, but where's the teeth in the UN process? And then I realized, wait a minute, we are the teeth. We're the ones that's going to push this forward. That's how it was for the 30 years that we worked on the UN Declaration on Rights of Indigenous Peoples. We had to push every single thing we've ever gotten at the United Nations, including, this opportunity to have a formal voice now coupled with the independent Indigenous voice of the caucus. So, we need to always be strategic. We're going to be talking about that. I hope everyone who's going will make the caucus meeting on the weekend before the COP starts, because we'll be talking about our key strategy points and who's going to be working on them and what our plan is to see how we're going to advance what we're doing there as Indigenous peoples pushing this forward. But we have made a lot of progress. And I hope that, some of my examples that I showed can reflect that. But the main thing we have to do is on the ground at home. We can't wait for the UN or the corporations or the countries to tell us we have a right to survive. We have to implement that at home.
Excellent, Andrea. Thank you for those detailed answers. And we do have a few more questions, but I just want to make one more announcement on behalf of the interpreters for us just to make sure that we are speaking slowly and clearly. And if you're having any issues as a participant receiving the interpretation, please let us know in the chat. Thank you so much. When we can't always hear them in our ears, sometimes we forget and get going in our presentation. So we apologize for that. Okay, Andrea, a couple more questions coming your way if you're ready. How is the issue of invasive species addressed over there? Is it internally or with any external help? Grasses and plants are difficult to deal with, unlike trees. So that's the first one. The second one from Oda Almas says, thank you, Andrea, for laying out the history of Indigenous peoples' efforts to influence the UNFCCC process. I wonder what you see as the path ahead for a further, more official role of Indigenous peoples in the negotiations themselves. Now, there is an Indigenous Peoples Caucus and as an independent voice, as you said, and the Facilitated Working Group as a constituted body. But our IPs involved in the climate negotiations also pushing for further official recognition of their voices in the decision-making process.
Okay, well, I can start with that one, and then I'll answer the invasive species issue, which is very important as well. I think one of the issues that we are going to be raising as the caucus, or that's the short word for International Indigenous Peoples Forum on Climate Change, and I know Graeme's going to talk. He's a co-chair of the caucus as well as a member of the FWG, so he'll be talking more about that. But one thing, for example, in the loss and damage discussion, I was asked as a member of the FWG to serve as a member of the new expert body on non-economic losses. But when I stopped being, when our term of office was over, when the new group took over in June at the Substa in Bonn, and at that time I was told I would no longer be a member anymore. And there is another member of the FWG who's great, Gunbrit from Sami. She's the Arctic member of the FWG. But I also asked them, well, isn't it their space here in this very vital issue for an independent expert voice from Indigenous peoples? And they said no. And this is something that came up when we talked to the United States delegation yesterday that's going to, is the confusion by states, or maybe it's just, more expedient for them to say, well, now we have this constituted body, the FWG speaks for Indigenous peoples in the UNFCCC. That was never our plan for this. It's good to have that official inside, but it doesn't replace the couple hundred Indigenous representatives representing their peoples from all over the world that participate, through the caucus. So we need to talk about that. And I think one of our proposals, I think we would like to even put it in our opening statement to the first plenary, is that there should be also an inclusion in all of the constituted bodies for an official representation of an independent Indigenous expert representing the caucus and then coming back to the caucus with that information, as well as the FWG. That's all fine, but why they think there just has to be one Indigenous person in these discussions that are so broad, and as someone mentioned, there we have so many different regional realities. We need to be not just there in the room, but official participants. That's one strategy that I think that we're already talking about, how to push forth at the upcoming COP. Second, regarding invasive species, as I mentioned, even genetically modified seeds like corn is an invasive species. All of this diminishes our ability to adapt. Cattle are an invasive species when it comes to the Americas. They don't come from here. And I showed that the importance of restoring the original, food animals on the plains. The buffalo not only resists the climate variances in a way that cattle can't because they're not from here, but it also adds to the restoration of the traditional grasslands. And the tribes here that are bringing back the buffalo are also working on restoring the original grasses to the plains, which then will hold that moisture and resist drought. So it's the same with, all of these different food programs that have brought in tilapia fish to rivers and lakes. They grow fast, they produce a lot of food, but I know Rochelle can speak to the impact of the invasive species, these fish that were brought in by people trying to, support enhanced food production, same with their excuse for GMO seeds, which reduce our ability to adapt. So that's why we have to fight climate change at the Convention on Biodiversity. We have to fight climate change at the World Intellectual Property Organization, at the UN Food and Agriculture Organization that's allowing all of these pesticides to proliferate that kill then the bees and the pollinators that also impact our ability to adapt on the ground. So unfortunately, we have to be at all these different bodies and coordinate our work. So I want to say that, that issue, is addressed not very much at climate change. And this is something we have to fight in the Article 6, the international cooperation. They're coming in with invasive species in the name of creating New Zealand, we just heard about, or date palms and oil palms and other kinds of plants that don't come from there, but they're using it as an excuse in order to minimize climate change or to enhance biodiversity, and it really isn't. So these are just things that we have to be aware of and coordinate with our partners that are in these different bodies to make sure that we are enhancing our ability to survive on the ground through protection of our original biodiversity.
Thank you, Andrea. You're almost done in the hot seats. We just have a couple more minutes, so I'm going to present one more question. And if you could answer it briefly, if we need to go back and touch on it, we can do that later. And then for those of you who have put questions in the chat, I'm just going in order. So if yours has been missed, we will revisit it. So thank you for bearing with us. All right, Andrea, it is very important to involve Indigenous peoples in the activities of the fight against climate change, but it is difficult to do projects and come to realize them without involving Indigenous peoples organizations as in Africa. There are NGOs at the local or national level that can carry out these projects, but they are not associated with Indigenous peoples groups or not legally established. So if they set up projects, they never find financing. What do you think about this so that these structures can find funding And I think this is relevant in both the climate change context as well as biodiversity and conservation. Andrea?
Yes, well, one thing that was accomplished, I guess you could say, or at least announced at COP26 last year, again, COP, the Conference of the Parties are the countries, but the president came and presented to Indigenous peoples the commitment of 1.7 billion with a B, dollars to support Indigenous peoples' efforts to combat climate change and protect natural ecosystems. And it was very unclear whether it was just for tropical forests and forest peoples, or just for Indigenous peoples from developing countries such as Africa, Latin America, or what we had proposed, that it be available to Indigenous peoples from all ecosystems. I mean, the Arctic ecosystems, the island ecosystems, all of these are threatened. The desert ecosystems, like where I'm sitting, all of these are very interrelated and interconnected, and also impact the rights of Indigenous peoples to live, to survive. So this process is under discussion now. It's important that we engage in this discussion at the caucus in particular to see how it's advancing. Are all Indigenous peoples involved? And we also want to make sure that they're not just focusing on a few intermediaries, whether they be states or big organizations or big funders, that Indigenous peoples doing smaller but essential projects in their own Indigenous lands also can access. Maybe somebody doesn't need $5 million. Maybe they need $20,000 for a water saving project or a seed bank, seed repository. So, all of these issues are still on the table. This is under development. I hope you're going to be there to engage in these discussions. There are regional focal points that have been designated, but our assumption is they are talking to the Indigenous peoples in their region to see what the needs are, and also to insist that we be the ones who help develop the criteria and the process for how these funds are to be distributed. So those are my answers. I know I'll pass it on to others who are equally knowledgeable in this process, and I look forward to listening. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrea. We really appreciate your time today, your detailed remarks, and the wealth of knowledge that you have in your experiences at the United Nations for all these years is immeasurable. So thank you for sharing that today. And I'm sure we'll be circling back to you when we open up the full Q&A at the end. And please continue to type your questions in the chat. While the question and answer session was happening, you could see an agenda in the background. So just quickly to let you know, we're about to go into our second presentation and by Graeme Reid, and that will be approximately 30 minutes with a 15 to 20 minute question and answer period. And at the end of the hour, we'll go into a 10-minute break. So everyone can grab a coffee, refresh themselves, and then we'll jump back into our third presentation, and then the longer, more inclusive question and answer session. So a quick rundown there. And I apologize to Graeme. We've cut in a couple minutes into your presentation. So without further ado, I will introduce from the International Indigenous Peoples Forum on Climate Change. He is the chair, and he is also the climate advisor at AFN, Assembly of First Nations. Graeme, welcome, and you have the floor.
Awesome. Chimigwech, Rochelle, and a big chimigwech to Roberto and Andrea and the UNDP team for hosting and putting this together. Hopefully you can see that on the screen. Ani and Bojo, Graeme Reid, Indigenous Cause, Ottawa, Nojaba, Makwadodem, Anishinaabe, and Dow, It's a real honor to join all of you from Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh lands, what's currently known as Vancouver. I'm not from here. I'm an uninvited guest from here. I grew up in Ottawa. On my dad's side, I have English and Scottish heritage, and on my mom's German and Anishinaabe from the Great Lakes. And my great-grandfather was born on Okomakong. I, as mentioned, have been privileged to serve in the role of co-chair of the International Indigenous Peoples Forum on Climate Change, the Indigenous Peoples constituency within the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change for about 3 and a bit years, potentially even a little bit longer. Just at the most recent intersessional meeting in June, assumed the role of the representative of the Facilitative Working Group for Indigenous peoples in North America. Want to begin by acknowledging all of the incredible work that Andrea continues to bring in this space, and the incredible depth of knowledge and experience, both with respect to the UNFCCC process, the climate process, but also the UN process more broadly. I wanted to today start to kind of talk about some opportunities for Indigenous peoples within the context of COP27, and then kind of get into short mechanics around, and there were some direct questions on influencing the process. So I'll share some of this. This first slide is a picture of the Indigenous Caucus. The Indigenous Caucus is organized in 2008 into the International Indigenous Peoples Forum on Climate Change. Every morning we have a meeting. This is a picture from one of those daily coordination meetings. There are 7 UN sociocultural regions that are implicated: North America, Latin America, Caribbean, Asia, Africa, Russia, Pacific, and Arctic. And here on the screen, you see representatives from all of those regions. I wanted to start just with a kind of a potentially depressing illustration on the next slide, which to Andrea's point, like kind of epitomizes the concern and the experiences that Indigenous peoples are facing across the world, which is the recognition that climate change is accelerating, and despite the processes that have been predominantly led by states, here on this graph you have different conventions or different agreements within the UN Convention on Climate Change and where we are in terms of cumulative carbon dioxide concentrations. And so you see in the middle in 1990s, as indicated, there was the Rio Declaration that created these Rio Conventions, the UNFCCC, as Andrea shared, the Convention on Biological Diversity, and the Convention to Combat Desertification. The second image on the screen was the Kyoto Protocol, which was passed in 97. Kyoto Protocol was actually a little bit more prescriptive for, in particular, global North countries and their role in reducing emissions. The result of that is it also had certain countries like Canada step out of the ratification process. The two that are at the top here are the Copenhagen Accord, which was a big disappointment, but announced that 1 billion target that was intended to be fulfilled by 2021. And I'll talk about that in an instant. And then finally, that LEAF is the most recent agreement, the Paris Agreement, the commitment in the Paris Agreement to keep global warming under 2 degrees in every effort to maintain it under 1.5. And then where we are now in 2021. I will say 2 comments on the Paris Agreement. As Andrea shared, there are 6 references to Indigenous peoples, including the preambular language around the rights of Indigenous peoples, which was an important window into the ongoing advocacy that Indigenous peoples have brought into that space. It also was not the initial request by Indigenous peoples to have a 2 degree or a 1.5 degree. It was a request to have a 1 degree because of all of the impacts that Andrea shared about what a changing climate would implicate on our lands, waters, and territories. part of that is also recognizing where we're at now. There have been a slew of different reports released this week, all of which basically saying that we're currently on the trajectory to at least 2.5 to 2.8 degree warming. As there was a slide that Andrea had about the magnified impact of that. I don't know the data for everywhere, but within what's currently known as Canada, if the global average temperature rise is either 2.5 or 2.8 degrees, in the Canadian context, south of Canada will warm at double that magnitude, so potentially a 5-degree future by 2100, and in the Arctic 3 times that, so 7.5 degrees, and we know that the impact to that level of warming is quite substantial for obvious reasons. On the next slide, starting to get into what we're doing in Egypt and in Sharm el-Sheikh around what is this conference all about. So as Rochelle and Andrea have indicated, these conferences happen every year, compared to, for instance, the Convention on Biological Diversity that generally meets every 2 years. There's been a delay in that process. But last year in Glasgow was an important COP for what they say is the finalization of the Paris Rulebook, the agreements within the Paris Agreement, or the articles within the Paris Agreement, and working to implement those solutions. One of the kind of outstanding ones, and I'll get to this in a little bit, is that concept of Article 6, which is carbon market and non-market approaches, essentially the creation of a carbon market system internationally. And so that was agreed upon. And really, so that means that this COP has been framed mostly as an implementation COP. And that's intended to offer space to come together, work with civil society and Indigenous peoples to respond to these threats. And this language is kind of taken from the presidency's website, which you see on the bottom there. Implementation, demonstrating implementation and collaboration. I think I'd be remiss not to say that there are a lot of geopolitical dynamics entering into the space, which is really, important to acknowledge, and important to acknowledge how that influences the potential process. We know that there's an ongoing Russian invasion in Ukraine. We know that Pakistan and many other countries are facing serious natural disasters, including as that is exacerbated by a changing climate and the climate change, and that other countries are really feeling the effects of this and calling for the creation of a loss and damage facility that I'll mention. And so it's, I think, important to acknowledge that we're existing in that, mostly because, as Andrea shared, the decision-making process is a decision-making process that occurs between states. And so essentially the role of Indigenous peoples is to pressure, direct, push states to take their human rights obligations and the rights of Indigenous peoples obligations seriously, among many other elements. And so on the next slide, like practically, what does this look like in practice? So this is the outline of the blue zone. There are generally 2 zones at each COPs. One is where the negotiations happen, which is the blue zone, and one is the green zone, which is intended to support the participation of civil society. In this space, currently, you see, that there are a lot of elements to the meeting and what we will work to aspire for. In the entrance, practically speaking, you enter through security every day. That's where you'll get your registration and your badges when you have your UNFCCC letter and your passport. What the 2 weeks kind of looks like in practice is on the next slide is really, and this is intended, this is from the perspective of the COP presidency, as well as the global champions, global climate champions on the bottom. And this is just an illustration of the types of days that both of these bodies are prioritizing for the topics to be discussion. And so you see that there's, in the beginning, the World Leaders Summit. The World Leaders Summit started last year in Glasgow they essentially invited heads of state from around the world and put them in a plenary room and just kind of rolled through, 5 to 15 minute presentations on all the great things that they're doing within their countries and how this should influence the process. The short answer is that it doesn't influence the process, at least not concretely, because the way in which these meetings operate is that they're depending on a specific agenda. That specific agenda leads to negotiation rooms, which leads to decisions, and I'll talk to that process in an instant. So here you see that there's, emphasis on finance and science and youth and decarbonization, agriculture, as was shared by Andrea, water and gender, energy, and action for climate empowerment, ACE, which is the distribution of essentially education-related curriculum, biodiversity, and the Solutions Day, which are important days. The next slide starts to lay out and starts to respond to many of the questions that were in the chat. So the Indigenous Peoples Caucus meeting, as Andrea indicated that it was important, will be on November 5th and 6th. That's the Saturday, Sunday. It's at something called the Mariner Hotel, and that information is circulated to the group. On a listserv that I put in the chat to respond to one of Brooke's questions. I'll put it back in the broad chat and just kind of request and invite folks to respond to that and ask for participation. It's one of the ways in which we coordinate. And through that process, we do a few things, but one of them includes drafting the opening statement. So first party groups, so countries and groups of countries, when the formal session is opened, have an opportunity to lay out their expectations for the course of the 2 weeks. They're generally given 2 minutes, and then each of the 9 constituencies, including the Indigenous Peoples constituency, is given 2 minutes to deliver a similar statement about some of the priorities that are being expressed. There's also, as mentioned, that World Leaders Summit, the Climate Implementation Summit, and then in week 2, we start to see some of the more political related events. There's a dialogue on climate finance. There's a roundtable on climate ambition before 2030. And then ultimately there's a closing session where our constituency will be asked to deliver another statement. Often we use that statement to respond to the negotiations and what is occurring by states. As I proceed, the next slide is just a quick reminder of the work plan of the Local Communities and Indigenous Peoples platform that Andrea had shared. And I wanted to share this mostly because it then informs the next slide that I'll get to in an instant. There are 3 broad areas of work within this Local Communities and Indigenous Peoples platform: knowledge, capacity for engagement, climate policies and actions, and then there's some cross-cutting proposals now as well. The stars here are just examples of the different ones occurring at COP itself. And so we have the annual gathering of knowledge holders that I'll reference in an instant. We have the multi-stakeholder workshop that's focused on Indigenous knowledge within science and research. And then ultimately the annual youth roundtable. There are others, and they are, for instance, there'll be a report back from the regional gathering held in Chad between Africa and the Asian region, and plans currently in the North American and Latin American context for early next year. On the next slide, on the Local Communities and Indigenous Peoples platform, on November 1st to 4th, there is the meeting of the Facilitative Working Group, as Andrea indicated, and then potentially more importantly are the next 5 days. So on November 7th, which is the Monday, There's the day one of the Indigenous knowledge holders session, which is intended to be a closed meeting between Indigenous knowledge holders. And then part two on November 10th is really communicating that out to state and other representatives. Similarly, on November 8th, which is the Tuesday, it's the roundtable with Indigenous youth. And then the report back is on Friday. And then the multi-stakeholder dialogue about strengthening participation in research and scientific processes is on the Wednesday. More kind of substantially on the next slide are the broad themes discussed at COP27, and then I'll get into the negotiation areas. So as you know, many of you likely know, there are lots of different themes, but broadly within the context of COP27, there are 4 key priorities: mitigation, adaptation, loss and damage, and finance. Mitigation being obviously those measures to limit climate change, reduce greenhouse gases and their effects. You know, really about prevention. Adaptation is about how we limit our vulnerability, recognizing that vulnerability is a product also of colonialism. It's a product of those other structural determinants that influence how an individual or community can adapt to a changing climate. And then loss and damage, ultimately, how do we address those impacts that can't be avoided through mitigation and adaptation, and really around that reparation kind of framework. And then finally, you know, finance. How do we make sure that there are appropriate resources available for Indigenous peoples and other members in the Global South to take adaptation, mitigation action, and when not possible, to support loss and damage. In the context of COP27, all 4 of these have different negotiation issues, which is on the next slide. On the mitigation, we have a few different ones. We have the global stocktake. The global stocktake is essentially one of the approaches that the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change takes to measure progress that is generally communicated through these things called nationally determined contributions, which are essentially greenhouse gas emission reduction pledges by individual states. And so that stocktake process is intended just to look essentially on the basis of those nationally determined contributions, or NDCs, how states are making progress. And we know the potential outcome of that because we've been communicating that, but the formal political outcome, which is intended to potentially accelerate action, is not going to take place at COP27. There are a few more technical meetings, but then will take place at COP28, but it's creating the framework in this context. As Andrea shared, there is now the decision on Article 6. The Article 6 decision has 3 parts: 6.2, 6.4, and 6.8. 6.2 is defining what they call an internationally transferred mitigation outcome is, or ITMO, which is, you know, essentially the system of carbon credits that'll be traded. 6.4 was that system. How do you actually trade ITMOs? What are the sorts of accounting, transparency, variability, validity of those different carbon trinkets, and then our carbon markets, or our carbon trading markets. And then 6.8 is the non-market mechanisms, which is intended to work on a work plan. But really at this COP, there's going to be discussions and negotiations on the grievance mechanism. How do Indigenous peoples communicate any potential violation of their rights from Article 6? There's also negotiations on what they characterize as the mitigation work plan. The mitigation work plan is intended mostly to essentially like communicate best practices for the reduction of you know, greenhouse gases in different sectors, you know, whether it's industrial or forestry or oil and gas or transportation. It's really intended to open up those conversations. On adaptation, they're going to be further negotiating on the work plan on the global goal on adaptation, including how do you define adaptation, how do you calculate it, and how do you measure it. Generally speaking, adaptation is vastly underfunded as compared to mitigation. In a Canadian context, I think it's like it used to be around 5% of all climate-related funding went to adaptation and 95% went to mitigation. And there are a variety of different reasons for that. On loss and damage, so that's that reparations. There's the push in particular from small island states, as well as other countries in the global south, in order to create a loss and damage finance facility, a facility in order to support nations as they deal with loss and damage, and that will be up on the negotiation process, and then effectively operationalizing the Santiago network that was created a couple of years ago. And then finally, on the finance side, part of the priority around supporting loss and damage and the creation of that facility. And then also, as indicated in Copenhagen in 2009, there's the creation of this $100 billion pledge for global north countries to fund the global south countries. They have not yet met that, but there's an intended conversation on whether they can make that, or what's going to be replenished after in 2023. I'm going to just go through a few more slides on kind of mechanics, and then we'll stop for questions. So I kind of mentioned, and these are some very high level priorities that have been expressed by Indigenous peoples. The preparatory caucus is really important to really crystallize and kind of direct how folks want to engage in these different areas. And how do we support the engagement of different Indigenous experts within those processes? So really, how do we continue to uphold and uplift the Indigenous rights-based approach, both in the context of the platform, as well as the ongoing, as Andrea shared, references to Indigenous peoples within the kind of broad work of the UNFCCC. And that's, for instance, in the Glasgow Climate Pact, which is also known as the cover decision. There's about 8 references to Indigenous peoples within that, which is really constructive. How do we continue to leverage those rights adoption protections, the adoption of rights protections in Article 6? How do we include that within the global stocktake and ambition mechanisms that we need urgent and transformative climate action in line with this 1 degree future, even if it may or may not be plausible anymore? And then really, how do we uplift Indigenous-led solutions to adaptation and loss and damage? One of the practical ways on the next slide is through the Indigenous Peoples Caucus, the International Indigenous Peoples Forum on Climate Change. We put our listserv in the chat, and so would definitely invite all of you to participate in that. We have our daily meetings, we have our preparatory meeting, and then we have our general coordination. On the next slide, there are other constituencies that, Indigenous peoples participate in, including, for instance, women and gender. Sometimes they participate in the YOUNGO, which is the child and youth constituency. There are other constituencies. BINGO is the business constituency. NGO is the environmental NGOs. LGMA is the local governments and municipal actors. IPO is the Indigenous Peoples constituency. RINGO is the research. TUNGO is the trade unions. And then there's farmers, and there's also a disability caucus that has Indigenous representation. And so all of those 9 groups are one of the main ways in which non-party observers are organized. So I'm gonna skip the next slide. And just go straight to the Indigenous Peoples Pavilion. So there are other entry points to participate and amplify the voice of Indigenous peoples. We're very happy to report that we do have a pavilion again this year in the Blue Zone. We had a process of applications for events. We've received around 100 events where we have space for about 75. So we've been working to combine those. And we'll soon release the agenda for that. Have a very active and opportunistic area around, really just amplifying the solutions at each of our community level within that space. We also have entry points within other processes. So the next slide references just a few different areas and components of what's discussed at the COP, and I'll dig into some of these in the slide after this. So there's the plenary rooms, often where chief negotiators or ministers communicate. That's where we deliver our statement at the opening and closing. There are these working level rooms where the negotiations actually happen. The high level events are generally those kind of side political events, including, for instance, the World Leaders Summit, and then the kind of side events and pavilions. For instance, the Indigenous Peoples Pavilion. We know there's a Climate Justice Pavilion, there's a Canada Pavilion, and so there are, you know, opportunities for Indigenous peoples to influence those processes as well. On the last two slides, the next slide is really just an articulation of how it works in practice. And so unfortunately, some of the kind of content didn't fit perfectly, but what I wanted to share in this is so there's a session agenda, and that session agenda is currently up on the website, on the UNFCCC website. In that, it outlines the agendas for the COP, and then for the two permanent subsidiary bodies, the subsidiary body on science and technological advice, the SBSTA, SBSTA, or the subsidiary body for implementation, the SBI. And under each of those subsidiary bodies, there are then negotiating items that are generally taken up within these contact groups. And so, for instance, there will be inevitably a negotiation around loss and damage and the potential creation of the finance facility. There'll be a negotiation around Article 6 and the independent grievance mechanism on adaptation. GST is the global stocktake, and then the political text, among many others. And there might be others that you're interested in. Those contact groups are smaller technical conversations of state representatives. And then, you know, essentially when they negotiate, once they confirm negotiation, it then moves back into those plenary sessions, starting with the SBSTA, the subsidiary body for science and technological advice, and the SBI. And then when it passes those subsidiary bodies, it goes back up to the Conference of the Parties. And what is the opportunity for Indigenous peoples? So we're not decision makers, obviously, but we have the opportunity to influence, you know, the process within contact groups and the decisions that different parties take place through a variety of different ways. But that's definitely kind of that element on negotiations. If you are interested in negotiations, you want to see that kind of technical element, hot tip is not to try to follow all of them, like really pick one and focus on that and really acknowledge that these things are deeply complex. The final point, and I know, Rochelle, I'm almost at my time, is on the next slide on like what actually happens within those negotiating rooms. And this is just a very crude articulation of what that looks like in practice. You have in the black here parties that sit around the table. Behind them are observers like Indigenous peoples, and each of those sessions is coordinated and facilitated by co-facilitators that have been identified by parties. And so those co-facilitators really manage the process. They invite parties to take the floor, express their views, propose language, agree or disagree with different proposals. Observers can't generally take the floor. There are specific instances where constituency groups have been invited to take the floor, for instance, on the negotiation around the creation of the Facilitative Working Group. The Indigenous Peoples constituency was invited to comment on specific, proposals by parties. That did not always, that does not happen in many other rooms, but it is, an important kind of precedent that was set in terms of the distinct role and status of Indigenous peoples, and then we often try to influence specific party negotiators based on our regional, representation or partnership. So what practically happens if there is consensus, and in the UNFCCC, consensus means unanimity. So it means that no party can object to any of the language contained within within the decision text. And so I think that's a really important kind of just element to emphasize, because consensus for Indigenous peoples is very different. But consensus for states within this process is if one party objects, it cannot continue. And for instance, there was several years ago a challenging negotiation at the end of, I think it must have been COP24, on whether or not the parties, took note of the findings of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IIPCC's report on global warming under 1.5 degrees, or welcomes. And the implication is welcome is a more positive acceptance of that report, takes note is just an acknowledgement that, it's in existence. And for instance, Saudi Arabia in that context would not support language that welcomes the report. If in the rooms there is no consensus, that topic area, it's communicated by the co-facilitators to the different subsidiary bodies, and then those subsidiary bodies will lead to further negotiation, often in the second week around with ministers. So that, I think, kind of concludes the kind of broad overview. I know it went in a lot of different areas, but keen to take questions and reflections.
Miigwech, Graeme, thank you so much for your detailed presentation and really sharing important information for those heading to COP27. I think you really gave them a visual of what to expect there, as well as detailed ways to have full and effective participation while at the COP. So I'm going to dig into some questions here for you. I'll do the same as I did with Andrea. I'll give you 2 at a time.
Mm-hmm.
First, we have Barbara Torres and Lynn Palmer have very similar questions. How can we engage with Indigenous leaders at COP27 before and after, especially if we are not attending the meeting? And then we also have how can Indigenous and local communities collaborate across continents to share their knowledge, work together on climate mitigation and adaptation, etc.
Yeah, miigwech, Rochelle, and miigwech for the questions. The second question, just in terms of sharing knowledge, as Andrea indicated, despite our non-participation within the creation of what is now called the Local Communities and Indigenous Peoples Platform, one of the things that our Indigenous representatives pushed for is to make space for the ability for Indigenous peoples, at least within that context, to share their experiences, best practices, and systems of knowledge. And in the chat, I just put the link to that. Key to the protection and assurance of those, any sharing that folks want to communicate, is really rights, safeguards, and protocols that was pushed, including by Andrea, as well as Daily Samborduro, around what are the sorts of rights protections that need to be incorporated and considered within the sharing of information. And so there is on those websites an opportunity to kind of share resources with one another. And then the intention of the creation of the annual knowledge holders gathering, as well as the regional knowledge holders gathering, is really to kind of do what's most appropriate for these systems of knowledge sharing, which is on the ground in our lands, waters, and territories. And so that's intended to help facilitate that process outside of the UNFCCC. I'll note, what I think is really important, and I'll share my frustration with the state-led process is, building Indigenous networks of solidarity for climate exchange is so important and needs to exist in parallel to these UNFCCC processes. And as was indicated, the action occurs on the ground in our communities, and we need to uplift that. The second question was, how do folks get involved? I think the first way is to sign up to that listserv, and we'll be sharing opportunities and experiences. We don't really have a good indication currently on kind of connectivity within the Indigenous Preparatory Caucus, nor do we have that in the daily caucus. But at least being on those listservs, we'll be able to kind of stay tuned to what's occurring, where and how. We are also working to confirm the live stream of the Indigenous Peoples Pavilion, which will be communicating the different events and people that are being led by Indigenous peoples, and then on an ongoing basis, like how do we then support all those interested in bringing them into the conversation, both intercessionally but also within the events that the June event or the COP.
Okay, thank you so much. Thank you to the interpreters. We really appreciate you. We know it's very difficult to do real-time live interpretations. We really appreciate you being here, the silent force behind us. So thank you again. And I'm going to go ahead and proceed. And if we're having any more issues, I'll keep my eye on the chat. It's crucial that all of our participants are able to follow along. So. And Graeme, back to you. First, we have somebody asking if you could repeat what you said about the modality of participation for Indigenous peoples in COP27, that you commented that you'll be given the floor directly. So if you could just repeat or embellish on that a bit. And we have a really important question from our brother, Stel Vicente. How are you ensuring that local communities are not given the same rights as Indigenous peoples? And we know this is a topic that is going to come up on site. So we'd appreciate it if you could give that some time, Graeme. Thank you.
Yeah, awesome. Miigwech, Rochelle, and again, miigwech to the questions and to our interpreters. I'll respond to 3 questions at once. So in terms of the new modality, I was referencing just the negotiation in the process to the lead up to the facilitative working group. And so in those negotiations that occurred, at COP23, 24, and 25, like a representative of the Indigenous Peoples Caucus was provided space to share our perspective. That's not guaranteed in every kind of forward negotiation, but there is at least precedent for, in that context, constituencies to speak within these spaces. That is related to the question around like how do observers participate, and pressure negotiators. So, as you engage and participate in these processes, you start to notice, who is representing which country and build those relationships with different party representatives. And through that process, you can kind of push and engage with those different actors in order to kind of, influence what they will say or don't say. One thing that we do at the Indigenous Peoples Caucus is we respect regional processes. So if you are, for instance, as myself as a member of the North American region, like if I wanted to talk to some country in the Latin American region, I would first interact with the Indigenous peoples from that region to make sure the appropriate protocols are followed. And just that we, build those networks and support those the kind of regional processes and engagement. For instance, we within a Canadian context have Indigenous representatives on the Canadian delegation that help influence, Canada Del positions and the communication that they bring to the different areas. On the distinct status and rights of Indigenous peoples within COP27 as those that are, a little bit more uncertain of local communities, I think part of what Andrea kind of articulated was the longstanding position that Indigenous peoples carry within this space. We can't speak on behalf of local communities and, except to acknowledge that there are, a 30+ year journey for the upholding, protection, and safeguarding of Indigenous rights and the rights of Indigenous peoples as affirmed within the UN Declaration. And so our position needs to be quite clear on how we communicate that and ensure that there's no misattribution between Indigenous peoples and local communities. I will note the caucus is very attuned to, Indigenous peoples and the challenges of state recognition. And so we, clearly support and avoid the tendency to ensure that indigeneity is based on state recognition. That's not the approach that we take. And so in some instances, local communities are Indigenous peoples, but from a caucus perspective, we recognize them as Indigenous peoples. The final point that I'll just share is, as this is a recurrent issue, it also justifies the need to identify the importance of the local communities and Indigenous peoples platform and the Facilitative Working Group as it's made up of 7 Indigenous representatives and 7 state representatives, but also acknowledge as to why the Indigenous caucus is so important and why there needs to be that political voice for Indigenous peoples, because, we're effectively talking about a joint technical body, constituted body with states, many states who are pushing agendas that don't recognize Indigenous peoples. So important, again, to ensure we acknowledge the distinction between those two groups.
Excellent, Graeme. Thank you so much. It's a very complicated situation, and you answered it quite eloquently. So thank you. If people still have questions about that particular subject and some of the other questions that were here, we can circle back and continue to add questions in the Q&A. I just want to say we see your questions here. Brooke Thompson, and we're going to save that to the end about the knowledge holders being selected. I think Andrea can help with that. I know IITC helped to facilitate the knowledge holders participation. So please hold on for an answer to that one. And we see your questions, your question, Oda, as well. So we'll either answer that in the chat or we'll circle back, but we definitely want to give people some time to have a little break and have a stretch. So we're going to go into that break right now, and we'll see you back here on the hour. Thank you so much. Thanks again, Graeme. A virtual applause for you, and we wish you the best of luck in your leadership there. And one final call out for volunteers at the pavilion. They're always needed. So
awesome. Yeah, miigwech, Michelle.
We are about to go into our third and final presentation of this webinar before we go into about a 30-minute question and answer period. So I have the pleasure of introducing Sameera Savarala, and she is with UNDP. And she, along with other speakers in this session, will be giving you an overview of the UNDP climate strategy with their policies team. Sameera will also be introducing the rest of her team. So with that, I'm going to pass the mic over to Sameera. Welcome, and you have the floor.
Great, thank you so much, Rochelle, and hi everyone, really lovely to be here. First and foremost, I just wanted to say I have deep admiration and gratitude for all of you and all of the work that you've done. I know it can be quite difficult, and just to say that really appreciate your efforts, and we're here to support you in this as well. My name is Sameera Savarala. I'm a program specialist with the Climate Strategies and Policy team for UNDP. I'm here with my colleagues Verania Chow, who is also program specialist focused on gender with the Climate Strategies and Policy team, and then also Lorenzo, who's our regional country coordinator for the Latin American Caribbean region, also within the same team. Today, we're going to provide you with an overview of what the NDCs are. I'm sure you've heard a lot about them. They might have been referenced in previous presentations, and apologies, I couldn't join for the earlier presentations due to other conflicts. But we wanted to kind of do a deep dive into what exactly are these NDCs, where did they come from, how are they related to the Paris Agreement, and then what we're doing within UNDP through the UNDP Climate Promise to support social inclusion and Indigenous peoples' participation in the NDC process, and then finally to share some examples with you from the Latin American Caribbean region, noting, however, that we do have examples from across regions that we can provide. So without further ado, next slide, please. Great, thank you so much. So the Paris Agreement, as most of you probably know, has the overarching goal of limiting global warming to well below 2 degrees Celsius by the end of the century. Preferably now, as we know, 1.5 degrees is really the ultimate target, and to keep most people safe, especially the most vulnerable communities. So really 1.5 is the goal that science and also communities are telling us that we need to use as our focus. The Paris Agreement process established a process for the nationally determined contributions, or NDCs. As the Paris Agreement was first ratified, the idea was to put forth intended NDCs. So what are your kind of first draft of your nationally determined contributions? These nationally determined contributions are meant to allow countries to increase their efforts to reduce emissions and increase resilience over time in order to achieve that temperature goal that I stated earlier. So while many parties saw this as kind of a mitigation strategy, of course, for many of the lower emitting parties and more vulnerable countries, this really was also an opportunity to share adaptation and resilience strategies and planning for that as well. So while it is, focused on mitigation efforts to reduce the global temperature rise, it does have a strong adaptation and resilient component, and we'll see that it also that's increasing over time as well. Countries are requested to prepare, communicate, and implement their subsequent NDCs every 5 years. And the idea is that there should be progression with each NDC. So it's using what's called the ratchet mechanism. So the idea is that your NDC will be increased in ambition with each iteration, right? So based on the latest science, based on your current NDC, the next NDC is meant to be more ambitious. So for example, if the current NDC has 30% emissions reductions by 2050, then the idea is that hopefully you'll be able to reach maybe 45% emissions reductions by 2050, et cetera. So really trying to find ways for governments to enhance their NDCs and their ambition over time. This was also an important component of how the Paris Agreement was even agreed upon, is to allow this nationally determined contribution component. This is really at the heart of the Paris Agreement. In past iterations and frameworks that have taken place, such as the Kyoto Protocol, there was kind of across the board the same goal for all parties that were party to the Kyoto Protocol. Whereas this allows for countries to share their climate plans towards this temperature goal based on their own country contributions, based on the common but differentiated principles and responsibilities principle. So we really see that this is an opportunity to allow each country to tailor their climate plans based on their needs and their political will, essentially. Next slide, please. So as I was saying before, the NDCs are at the heart of the Paris Agreement. The process originally, and this was a conversation that's taken place over time, right? In 2011, at COP27, there was originally that process to have the Paris Agreement in the first place and what that would look like, what this next climate agreement would look like was kind of started in 2011. Again, seeing that the Kyoto Protocol was not achieving what it was meant to achieve, and notably the United States was not party to the Kyoto Protocol, which was critical as they were the biggest emitter. And then at COP19, that's really when parties decided that they would prepare their INDCs, right, to kind of show, okay, what will be forthcoming with the Paris Agreement? What will countries be able to prepare these types of plans in the first place? What would that look like? And then 2015, you had 147 parties responding with their INDCs, kind of their initial plans, their first drafts, if you will, of their NDCs here. And then the idea is then in 2020 was then the enhancement period, right? So that's when the next set of NDCs were meant to come forth. Next slide, please. So the Paris Agreement, specifically within Article 3 and Article 4.2, that's where we're kind of seeing this language specifically on the NDCs. As I mentioned, each government is deciding based on their circumstances and capacities what they'll include in the NDCs. It's meant to reflect, if we can go back one, back. Oh, thank you. They should reflect the short and medium term measures for reduction of national emissions and resilience building. They would be integrated into the country's policies and plans. This is critical here because this is the first time we're seeing, the climate plans starting to really take shape across sectors and a kind of a whole of government approach, as they say, right? So the NDC was meant to be an opportunity to bring together different sectors, different stakeholders to really be engaged in developing a national plan on climate for countries towards the Paris Agreement. And then this, of course, is also should be part of this long-term strategy. So how are parties looking at this beyond just their 2030 targets, looking at mid-century and end of century targets as well, is important to consider as part of the NDC. Next slide, please. Some of the milestones that have taken place, we had in 2018, the Talanoa dialogue, which was led by the COP presidency Fiji, towards kind of informing the next round of NDCs. And then in 2020, as I mentioned, they were asked to communicate the new NDC, right? Because I said it's every 5 years. So in 2015 was kind of when the INDCs became the first NDC for many countries. And then the next iteration, 5 years later in 2020, they're meant to submit their new, more updated, more ambitious, ideally NDC. Of course, many of them started to come in 2021 because of pandemic. At COP26, it was delayed. So there was a little bit of extra time for that first iteration. And then sorry, I just saw a note to slow down. So sorry, I'm speaking so quickly. I just know we have a lot to cover today. And I wanted to note also in 2023, the global stocktake will also take place. So next year, there will be a stocktake, which will consider all of the NDCs, where we are so far, but also look at all of the inputs from experts, from civil society groups, et cetera, that are kind of helping to paint an overall picture on where we are collectively on achieving the Paris Agreement goal. So that exercise is already underway, and the overall outcome of the stocktake will take place next year by COP28. And then in 2024, just to note also the enhanced transparency framework to look specifically at the emissions data and inventory that's taking place with countries. I'm not going to go into that here because I just want to focus on the NDCs. A few key milestones also to note: the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the scientific body that has been preparing many of the reports that are informing Paris Agreement discussions, just put out the special report on the 1.5 degree goal, of course, a couple of years ago. Also at COP26, most recently, it was decided common timeframes for the NDCs. So that means now that NDCs, they'll be communicated every 5 years with a 10-year time frame. So the NDC that's communicated in 2025 should have an end date of 2035. The next NDC that's communicated in 2030 has an end date of 2040, and so forth and so on every 5 years. And then if the stocktake that I mentioned that will take place next year, the idea is those will take place every 5 years as well, and to get a sense of where the NDCs are. Next slide, please. So very exciting this week, actually, the UNFCCC just put forth their NDC synthesis report. So I wanted to share some of those results. This just came out yesterday or the day before. I won't go into all of the details, but essentially to say that of all of the NDCs that have been communicated as of 23rd of September this year, The world is currently on track for a 2.5 degree Celsius warming by the end of the century, if all of these NDCs are actually implemented, right? So this is not current projections based on where we are. This is if those NDCs are actually implemented. To note, there's going to be an increase of emissions by 2030. The idea is for much more significant emissions reductions, but the ambition is increasing slightly. I know that doesn't sound very promising, and at the end of the day, it's not nearly enough, but the ambition is increasing. New NDCs are coming forth that are more ambitious, which is important to note that that is working, but it's not ambitious enough. And so we definitely need to see a much more significant reduction in emissions and more ambitious NDCs, in particular from the highest emitters. So I did want to highlight that. I've kind of gone over time for my segment, but happy to answer questions. And hopefully this provided you just kind of a general overview of what NDCs are. Now my colleague Varania will go into how UNDP is supporting countries on their NDCs and to make sure that they're more inclusive in the process. So over to you, Varania.
Thank you, Sameera. And again, thank you so much for the invitation to participate in this session. And I'm glad to be here with all of you. Again, my name is Varania Chow, and I'm the thematic lead on climate, gender, and inclusion as part of the climate strategies and policy team. And we are conducting our work mainly through one of the UNDP initiatives. And I want to talk about the UNDP Climate Promise Initiative. Is the world's largest offer of support to countries on NDCs. It was launched at the UN Secretary General's Climate Ambition Summit in September in 2019. And it was UNDP's commitment to ensure that any country wishing to increase the ambition that Sameera was referring to had the really the means to do that. And so we have been focusing and working very closely with countries in increasing this ambition at the national level and to improve the national climate pledges. Also, the climate promise, our support draws upon UNDP's extensive portfolio and experience on the ground. As you may know, UNDP works very closely with countries, with governments, but also with other non-state actors on different areas related to climate change, such as energy, forest, water resilience, of course, gender equality, social inclusivity, finance, etc. And this really builds upon, UNDP's work and established track record, I would say, in supporting governments to find ways of amplifying the dialogue around this area of work, but also improving and strengthening the capacities in terms of the design and the planning process, and be able to deliver on climate action. I wanted to point to some of the figures that we have on the slide. So it's 127 countries that are part of this initiative. We collaborate with different partners, other UN organizations, but also other partners outside from the UN system. And we cover over 85% of all developing countries are represented, are part of the climate promise. And we also cover 25% of the global greenhouse gas emissions under this initiative. I also wanted to say that the approach of this work and the focus has been not only on engaging with governments, but also, as I was mentioning at some point, with non-state actors, and ensuring that they are enabling conditions for a whole of society approach. Next one, please. Thank you. So the climate promise countries have not only prepared, let's say, and submitted and enhanced NDCs, they have also looked at the NDC process as such. So not so much at the output, but also at the process that leads to that outcome or a specific output. And in that sense, they have also strengthened, the institutions and the policies and the transparency systems to be able to report back on the progress, and have also identified and mobilized finance, and have also really worked around mainstreaming NDC priorities in the development plans, because as Sameera was pointing out, the NDC is just one of the several climate instruments that are out there, but it's the one that really help us to better articulate all the work on climate and the response from that country on climate at the national level. I wanted to mention a few examples in terms of the areas that we work with and that the countries are focusing on. So for example, countries are establishing or strengthening policies, institutions, and capacities for effective NDC implementation. This has to do with developing or improving the work around, as I was saying, other climate instruments, such as the national adaptation plans. It also has to do to improve their own clarity and guidance in terms of how is that they will achieve NDC implementation. So countries have been developing NDC implementation roadmaps and or strategies. They have also looked at what needs to be adjusted or changed to really allow for these transformational results. And then, countries have been looking at the climate policy frameworks and also the legislative and the regulatory frameworks. On the other hand, countries have also looked at identifying and mobilizing resources. As you may have heard, one of the key aspects to be discussed in terms of the NDCs is the implementation phase. And for that, countries need not only the financial resources, but also to have clarity in terms of how is that they will invest the resources and how to better allocate in a strategic manner the resources that they can leverage from different sources and systems. So countries are looking into financing strategies and investment plans. They've also been conducting assessments to inform the financing frameworks. As you may know, there are different institutions and actors involved in when it comes to public finance within the countries. Next one, please. Then there are also other areas that countries have been focusing on in terms of advanced systems to monitor and report on climate action. This is really relevant because it allows countries to look into where the progress is being made, but also where the gaps are in terms of emissions reductions, in terms of increasing resilience, in terms of also financial gaps that they may address. And this is also an opportunity to look back and improve their strategies or approaches. And then another area that the climate promise is supporting is the need for countries to mainstream NDC priorities and measures into the development plans, and the need to also articulate with other development frameworks such as the Sustainable Development Goals. So the aspect of linking the NDCs and the SDGs on the national level, it's really important. And also there is another aspect that it's important for NDC implementation that has to do with the role of the subnational level governments and actors as well. So these are the areas, let's say, in which countries have been focusing as part of the support provided by the climate promise. And moving forward, will be important to ensure that developing countries have the mechanisms and the support in place to transit from the planning and the designing into the implementation and monitoring, and mainly in a more articulated manner. Next one, please. So within all these areas that I was referring to, we see a lot of potential and room for integrating social inclusion and gender equality dimensions. In every of these areas, there is an opportunity to make sure that social dimensions are well integrated. And I wanted to also mention that we have seen countries working under the Climate Promise looking at these different areas and at the same time integrating social dimensions and gender equality dimensions, that the NDC, is far more strong and it's more ambitious and definitely more inclusive. And so we see this opportunity of reinforcing in terms of the inclusivity and the ambition of the NDC by having these enabling conditions and by working on these areas that connect to each other. So just to share a few key results, I wanted to say that, for example, over 90% of countries under the Climate Promise have increased the mitigation ambition. They all focus on the energy sector that we know is one of the key energies sectors to be able to reduce emissions. They have also focused on increased adaptation ambition, as Sameera was already saying during the first round of NDCs. Not every country focused on adaptation. Now we're seeing more and more this approach. We also see that 90% of countries included gender considerations. And I also wanted to point out that it's not only that countries are making references in general to gender dimensions, but to really looking at the role of women and gender equality in specific sectors. And we also see that countries refer to youth participation and youth organizations. And pretty much all of the, I would say all of the Climate Promise countries, roughly 100 countries, have organized multi-stakeholder consultations, including Indigenous peoples organizations and women's groups during the NDC revision process. So I think this is important to mention, as well as that a good number of countries, almost half of the countries, have conducted gender analysis, including an approach on Indigenous populations. So we see countries kind of bringing these dimensions more and more into the design and the development and planning of the NDC. Of course, there is a lot of work to do, and that's where we want to focus. Next, please. So I just wanted to give you a flavor of the areas that countries are working on in relation to gender equality and social inclusion. Selected countries have made specific references to gender equality in this particular case in both levels during the NDC revision process, but also these references are being included in the NDCs as such. So then it becomes, a commitment from the countries to, to consider for implementation. So I wanted to mention that, for example, one of the areas that they have prioritized is the coordination mechanisms and the institutional arrangements that are needed to be able to incorporate this approach in a more systematic manner. Another aspect that they have also included is the consultation process. As I mentioned, this has been one of the key entry points for countries to start building engagement with Indigenous peoples or civil society and women's groups, because as you may know, because I know that some of you have been already involved in this process of the NDCs. The first round of NDCs were not necessarily very bottom up, were mainly top down. So there was not enough space for different actors, such as non-state actors, to participate or to get involved. And then as I was saying, the relevance of looking into such as instruments such as the gender analysis, where they can identify capacity gaps and planning priorities. And as you have seen, many countries have incorporated into these analyses also an approach to consider other aspects of social inclusion, such as the role of indigenous peoples and local communities. Next one, please. Then from the social inclusion perspective, some of the results today that I wanted to share is that, again, some countries, they have encouraged meaningful participation of indigenous peoples in implementing climate action. And this has been mainly through the multi-stakeholder consultation process. I think that this, as well as I was saying, I think this has been a good entry point. It's something that needs to be strengthened to be institutionalized in a way. So to be able to create a coordination mechanism between the government and non-state actors to continue this consultation and to build this partnership. So we hope to see this in the near future. We also see the development of financing strategies or investment plans that include not only the gender aspect, but also that include indigenous peoples' considerations, whether this came from the consultation process or they are trying to set some criteria to make sure that the financing strategies really respond to different actors. And then a last point that I wanted to say that has been also a key entry point has been the development of gender and climate action plans. This has been a result of the analysis, and we have seen, how countries have included the perspective not only, as I was saying, on gender, but also on other relevant groups such as indigenous peoples. So I think this gives a good idea of the work that countries have been doing, the results so far, but also the opportunities that there are to continue strengthening this process and to make sure that many of these initiatives are actually formalized, are established in a more systematic manner at the national level. And it would be really interesting to hear from you, where do you see the areas that require additional strengthened and support? Next one, please. Here I just...
Sorry to interrupt, excuse me, but if you could please wrap up.
Yes, thank you. Yes, this is actually almost my final slide. So I'm just going to point, to these country examples. I think we will share the PowerPoint presentation, so you can just come back to the examples. And then maybe if we go to the last slide, please. Just want to point it out that under the second phase of the climate promise, we are focusing very much on supporting countries to achieve the commitments and the pledges. And so it's focused on implementation. So here, what we are seeing in the planning stage is that countries have still been prioritizing these areas of work. One of the areas is access of indigenous peoples to green jobs, and considering this as one of the priorities. I have pointed which countries have included this in the work plans. Other countries have mentioned, the inclusion of indigenous peoples in national energy and action plans, in environmental loss assessments, and in climate financing strategies. So I just wanted to say that there is quite an opportunity to engage in these processes. And for UNDP, it would be really great that this is just the beginning of a conversation that can continue at the national level. I'll leave it there and happy to share any other ideas or thoughts during the Q&A session. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So I'm going to try to go first. Well, yes, I'm going to talk about indigenous people or NDC process in Latin American region. Next, please. Yes, first I'm going to talk about the context of indigenous people in Latin America and the Caribbean. Indigenous people represent between 8 to 10% of the population of Latin American region, around 42 million people, but constitute around 15% of the poor and 17% of the extremely poor in this region. Mexico, Guatemala, Peru, and Bolivia have the largest population, representing more than 80%, but there are other countries with large population, as in Honduras, Ecuador, and Colombia. The distribution between rural and urban is 50-50%, and indigenous people are very important on climate change. For example, in Latin America, almost 50% of the territory is covered by forest. And from this area, 35% of the forest area are under the influence of indigenous territory. So indigenous indigenous people are key actors for the implementation of the NDC, because a large portion of the emissions in the region, like 20%, is from the forestry sector, mainly for deforestation. In some countries, it's around 50%, as in Colombia, Peru, Paraguay. At the same time, indigenous territories have the lower average deforestation rates than other areas in practically every Latin American country. For example, in Amazon Basin indigenous territories lost around 10 times less carbon in their forests than in non-indigenous and not protected areas between the years 2003 and 2016. Dependence of natural resources and the situation of poverty makes indigenous people especially vulnerable to climate change, but at the same time, they are important actors for mitigation and adaptation action. Next, please. So, UNDP, as it was mentioned, have been supporting through the NDC support program and climate promise initiative implementation of NDCs. In the region, it supports 26 countries and support the submission of 21 more ambitious NDCs. In these NDCs, and especially in the countries with largest population of indigenous people, recognize that these populations are especially vulnerable to climate change and also relevant actors in the implementation of NDC measures, especially in the forestry and agriculture sectors. And also these NDCs say that the recognition of the rights of indigenous people, the value and respect for traditional knowledge and their ways of life are key elements for improving well-being, the preservation of forests, and agricultural practices against climate change. In all these NDCs, there were participatory process where indigenous people have been considered and informed. Next, please. I'm going to talk about a little more about the case of Peru of indigenous participation in the NDC. There were an activity which is called Let's Dialogue About the NDC, where the main stakeholders work with the government to identify the measures of the NDC, and indigenous people participate on that. But not only that, in a parallel way, the framework law on climate change was issued, and also the regulations. And this is very important for the implementation of the NDC, this law. And in the regulations of this law, indigenous people participate, and this regulation was consulted to indigenous people to participate more than 1,400 indigenous leaders. And the entire process of consultation with indigenous people was in accordance with the provision of the ILO Convention 169 and the Peruvian prior consultation law. And one of the results of this is, for example, that a platform for indigenous people for climate change was created. And this is like a window that indigenous people can use to work in the climate change management with the government, and also to participate in the high-level Commission on Climate Change, which is a governmental body where NDC measures are identified and proposed.
Thank you, Lorenzo. Thank you so much. I'm sorry for the bit of confusion there. And we are going to roll right into the Q&A. And we have one about the NDCs, and then we're going to move to Brooke Thompson's question. So Andrea, if you can be on deck to answer that, please. Okay, so do the NDCs count only the commitments that the government makes, or is it inclusive of those made by industries and other groups? Does it also include remote action taken by Indigenous peoples or civil society organizations individually? And this just disappeared. So
I'm sorry, Rochelle, it went into the answered questions because someone actually just, typed, yes, at the bottom of the answer.
Gotcha. Okay, and that's an important element to point out here. We are answering as many questions as possible live, but some of them have been answered in the answered section of the Q&A. You can see some typed answers to those questions. So please, if you have submitted a question, make sure you check there. And we're gonna then call on Andrea, please. If you could inform our participants on how the Indigenous knowledge holders are selected by Brooke Thompson.
Yes, thank you. As Graeme mentioned, we in the caucus, I guess you could, I'll call it the caucus instead of the long name, have a strong background of regional organization and representation. So before, several years ago, as I mentioned, we had a global coordinating committee made up by 2 representatives of each region. Now we don't have that anymore. We have our co-chairs, and then we have the main participation. But I know I can speak for North America, and I know some of the other processes are very strong regionally. Arctic, Latin America has, a pretty strong process too. But we as a region, we have what's called the North America Indigenous Peoples Working Group on Climate Change that we actually put into place after COP21. And we have utilized that process with a pretty formal process to select knowledge holders, also to nominate our members of the Facilitative Working Group, our member and alternates, which now we're in the second group. It's Graeme Reed is our formal member, working very closely with the alternate Chris Honani, who's coordinating the youth, co-leading the youth activities for the LSIP at the COP. So it is a representative process, and there are opportunities for participation, I hope and assume, and that was always kind of what we emphasized, at least in both the caucus and the Facilitative Working Group, that these regional processes are very essential to ensure that Indigenous peoples interested in the international work who may or may not be able to attend this COP or that COP credentials are a huge challenge. And I'm not sure how much we talked about that, the problems with actually participating, but not even to mention the finances of participating in these bodies. But there is a strong regional emphasis. So it's the regional coordinating committees, whatever they may be for your region. And it'd be good for you to find that out. Graeme can perhaps provide you with focal points for your region. I know Hindu is Ibrahim is the co-chair right now of the caucus for Africa, because also when we have a COP in a certain region, we make sure we have a co-chair that takes the lead for interactions with the states and the presidency as we develop the logistics for that particular conference of the parties. So right now, Hindu is, and if you're from Africa, I would talk to her about how you can participate in these processes. Of course, not all the knowledge holders. In fact, most of those that we consider knowledge holders are representative of organizations that are part of the working group that we have. So we rely on the members of the working group to identify knowledge holders from their areas, food producers, spiritual leaders, traditional knowledge holders of all kinds that they may know of, that those of us from other indigenous peoples and tribes may not know of. I may not know of the ones from Canada, for example, or the East Coast. So we all come together and make nominations and discuss them and present what their qualifications are. And we come to consensus in North America, at least I can tell you, on who we're going to be nominating for the knowledge holders, and also the youth constituency, and also the members of the facilitative working group. As we move into the next 3 years, we'll go through that process. So I would talk to some of the leaders from the caucus or the co-chairs from your region about how you can be involved in that process, either yourself specifically, or make nominations of knowledge holders from your tribal nation area. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrea, for that detailed answer. I'm sure it was very helpful for everyone listening. And Sameera, please, you have the floor to further answer the question on NDCs. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much. And thank you, Andrea, for providing that information. It's really helpful to see how the caucus is moving forward for COP. In addition to the great response that my colleague Claudia has shared in the chat regarding this really important question, just to share also that, yeah, the NDC is a government-driven process. Ideally, it includes different stakeholder engagement in the development of the NDC, as well as in the implementation of the NDC, as my colleagues have said. However, that's not necessarily always the case. And also, many of the announcements and commitments that are put forth by industries, private sector, other groups are not always included within the NDC. So for example, at COP26, we saw a lot of announcements that were happening outside of the process. So heads of state or CEOs or other groups would make big announcements that are not necessarily being tracked as part of the Paris Agreement process or as part of the NDCs. So just to note that there's also commitments and plans that are taking place outside of the NDC. But ideally, the NDC should, include those stakeholders and ensure that it does speak to all of the actions that are taken more broadly. But of course, it's more focused on what the government is pushing for. The question on how do they arrive at the emission reduction figures in the NDCs, again, that's based on the individual countries, right? On the analyses that they produce, on what they are able to actually do in terms of their emission reductions targets, also looking at scientific basis and using science to determine how much they can reduce using economic models, etc. So it really is up to the governments. But again, it's also based on political will. If there is a push from constituents to be more ambitious in climate, that also impacts how a government decides on their final targets. So I think that that's also notable here. So I did want to add that to that response. I know also Andrea asked a question about if we're preparing a report or analysis of IPs and NDCs. We are in the process of hopefully bringing on a colleague to look at this particularly and get us a better sense of an analysis of Indigenous peoples within the NDCs and provide further information for everyone through that as well from the climate promise perspective. And Verania might have something to add as well. I see your hand raised too. But yeah, thank you.
Verenia, do you want to start and then I can?
No, go ahead. You raise your hand before me. So go ahead.
Okay, wicked. Yeah, no, really appreciate all of the presentations by the UNDP team and the work that they're doing. I wanted just to say that next week, the International Working Group for Indigenous Affairs, IFGIA, and a bunch of like scholars and other folks have reviewed the kind of 2 sets of NDCs for the recognition of Indigenous peoples in kind of 5 broad categories: our Indigenous knowledge systems, our rights, our participation, the impact of colonization, and our knowledge systems. And that policy paper will be released next week. There is also going to be an event at COP27 that we're putting on to actually explore the findings, and that'll be on Saturday the 12th. So just wanted to kind of share that, like, some of that is being done in terms of like kind of trying to track who and how individual countries are acknowledging Indigenous peoples and the diversity of their contributions. And would just point that to folks. I will just say one point, but before going to Verenia, that one of our elders in this space have been raising for a little while, Elder Frank Edowagijek, is the concept of IDCs, indigenously determined national contributions, and really the intention is to uplift the role of Indigenous peoples in communicating their expectations and aspirations for greenhouse gas emission reductions, recognizing that, to the point in the chat, a lot of what nation states are claiming are greenhouse gas reductions come from Indigenous lands, waters, and territories, and important to acknowledge that within this process and the contributions that Indigenous peoples bring. So miigwech, and I'll go back to you, Verenia.
Thank you. Yeah, I wanted to actually respond to the other question on the chat. Just to add to what Sameera was already saying, yes, our goal is to do a very thorough tracking of the Indigenous peoples' considerations within the NDCs in the coming months. We have done a very thorough analysis and tracking. We have a very comprehensive database for the gender equality considerations, and we are planning to do the same for the Indigenous people. So that's coming, and we will be in touch with many of you, I'm sure. But just wanted to respond to the other question about why is the NDC Indigenous Peoples Local Initiatives are not, I don't know if that's the translation correctly, but you know that so the question was like, why Indigenous Peoples Local Initiatives are not integrated into the NDCs or are not well articulated. And I wanted to say that this mainly has to be, not only that this is a very government-driven process, as was already mentioned. I think it has to do with the fact that there are not necessarily the mechanisms in place that allow for this systematic coordination and engagement. And I think that's where we need to focus our attention, to make sure that the enabling conditions, the enablers, are there. And that means to have, you know, the coordination mechanisms in place, to have the institutional arrangements with non-state actors, to make sure that these processes are not one-off, are not just for, you know, the NDCs, but really look at the comprehensive agenda that it's required to respond to the climate crisis. And I wanted to say that there are some processes and instruments within the climate policy architecture that already offer some good examples. For example, the national communications, as part of the process and the guidelines that countries or governments have to follow, there is explicit reference to, on the one hand, a scoping phase and the stakeholder engagement. So every time that a country has to report back on their work on climate through a national communication, they have to make sure that there is a thorough stakeholder consultation or engagement. Well, these kind of practices needs to be translated. These are the good practices that needs to be translated into other climate policy instruments and processes. So I just wanted to say that that's the area where we want to focus our attention to make sure that, as I was saying, this is once we have found a good entry point to strengthen the engagement of non-state actors, we need to keep nurturing, and we need to make sure that this is formalized for the future and for other climate change policy instruments and processes. Thank you.
Thank you, Vrania. Thank you so much. I see we still have some questions coming into the chat. Unfortunately, we are at the end of our time here today. We only have 4 minutes left for closing remarks, and that wouldn't be sufficient time to answer these detailed questions, unfortunately. So once again, you'll be sent this recording and hopefully all of our contact information as well. That way you're able to follow up with presenters individually and able to have time to break down those questions and answers and engage directly. So we apologize for running out of time and space here. It's been a robust 3 hours, and we definitely have to respect our interpreters that have been on with us all morning. So with that, I'm going to move into, oh, Andrea, did you have a final remark?
No, I'm waving goodbye.
Oh, okay. All right, Andrea's getting us started on the final remarks, and I'm going to stay with UNDP, and please call on Nina for your final remarks. Thank you. Nina, you have the floor.
Thank you so much. I wanted to thank everyone that presented today. This was a very dynamic, informative event, and I wanted to thank Tribal Link Foundation, the International Indian Treaty Council, the International Indigenous Peoples Forum on Climate Change, Roberto, Andrea, Graeme, Rochelle. Thank you so much for making this happen and joining us in giving this very helpful information to Indigenous peoples. I also want to thank UNDP and the Climate Strategies and Policies team, all the interpreters, and everyone who attended. We're here to help, and we're happy to continue facilitating any kind of capacity building that is needed by Indigenous peoples on any topic related to the Climate Convention. Please reach out to us, and I'll drop my information in the chat. But thank you very much to all, and thank you to the interpreters.
Thank you, Nina. Roberto, please.
Yes, I just wanted to echo the thanks. Appreciate everyone's time and the information, the important information that was shared today. I think that on behalf of Tribal Link and the other partners, we're looking forward to continuing to engage together to provide these type of resources to Indigenous peoples across the different conventions. Not only this, but also finding ways to show how we need to work together across all of the different conventions to really move what we want forward. So that's very important. The other thing is just to support the International Indigenous Peoples Forum on Climate Change as a way for folks who are interested in continuing. People were asking, how do we participate before and after? Get in touch with the caucus, get involved, make sure that you find out who your regional focal point is so that you can get connected to what's happening on the ground in your region. And that's some good advice for moving forward there. And as always, you can connect with any one of the host organizations or the facilitating organizations to follow up as well. So thank you all.
Thank you, Roberto. I will quickly deliver my closing remarks. I also want to thank all of our partners who made this possible. A lot of hard work went behind the scenes to ensure that this would be as successful as it turned out to be. So thanks to everyone who we see in the boxes today and everyone else who's put a lot of time and effort into this. Thank you so much. And of course, always acknowledging our interpreters. And just to plant the seed before everyone heads into COP27, and we're talking about transition minerals and moving to more sustainable resources. My community right now is under severe threat of one of the largest nickel mines in the world, which is what will be needed to continue powering electric cars. So I just want for everyone to keep this in mind, that not all solutions are great ones. And we really need to break down how Indigenous peoples will now be impacted by these transition minerals, as many of them are on our lands and territories. So I just wanted to share that, taking off my facilitator hat for a minute. So Chi-miigwech, thank you everyone for coming out today. We hope this was robust for you and informative. And as Nina mentioned in the chat, the UNFCCC process, the climate change process, is cross-cutting with the Convention on Biological Diversity. We have also some very important issues and threats that will be coming up at COP15 to be held in Montreal in December, from the 2nd of December to the 19th of December. And with partners, UNDP, the same partners we see here, Tribal Link and International Indian Treaty Council, we hope to bring another training to you. So please keep an eye on this space. And once again, Chi-miigwech, thank you. And we look forward to engaging with you further. Best of luck at COP27.